Hello and welcome to the first of the three webinars in the lead up to the next Georgetown Global Dialogues conference in Barcelona in early November. I'm joined today by Veronica Gago and Kohei Saito, two of the Global Dialogue Fellows. And we are going to be talking about a fate that seems pretty much universal today, which is powerlessness, a profound sense of weakness, both individual and collective, and inability to change our increasingly intolerable political conditions, economic circumstances, um, to tackle social discord. So I think this is, a condition that is now pretty much the human condition. And today I really want to explore this at a somewhat different level than the one we are accustomed to. I think the crisis that we are in is diagnosed mostly in terms of the rise and fall of this or that power, or what we call democratic backsliding, in the so-called advanced democracies of the West. But I think there's something much deeper than that is going on universally at this point, not just in Western Europe and the United States, but also in very many different parts of the world. Um, but I'll actually first turn to Kohei and ask him to give us a brief sketch of what he thinks this global crisis consists of. Have we come to a kind of impasse in not just the West or the East, but in the entire sort of modern adventure, as it were, the adventure of secular emancipation, the adventure of the secular enlightenment, the sort of pursuit of progress that inaugurated the modern world 200 years ago, the quest for a better future. Is all of that in danger now? And if so, how do we transcend these dangers? How do we confront these problems? Kohei, could you sort of briefly describe to us how you sort of first of all diagnose this condition of powerlessness?
Right. We all feel powerless. I guess you feel powerless. I feel powerless. Those who watch this conversation feel powerless. And I mean, this is understandable. I think in the last 10, 15 years, starting with Occupy Wall Street, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, Syriza, Podemos, and then after that, Fridays for Future, Green New Deal. There are a lot of movements, and that was really giving us some kind of hope. The situation under capitalism is, of course, getting worse, but once we sort of unite, we had slogans like system change or climate change, now or never. So that's like really demanding. If we continue this crisis, it's gonna be bad, but we can use this crisis also as an opportunity to build something better. And this kind of goes back to a very old ideas of what Rosa Luxemburg once described as socialism or barbarism. She was, writing at the moment of World War One, and then it's really when we build socialism, we can kind of overcome this situation of barbarism and so on. But I think today we are really witnessing a kind of turning point because all those movements I just mentioned fade away, fade out, and the crisis, especially the climate crisis, is getting worse and worse. And what's unique about climate crisis is that it's irreversible. If you don't do now, it's only getting worse. And after 10 years, if you realize it's bad, you can no longer go back to the original situation. It's only getting worse. And that really, I think, of course, accelerates other issues like inequality, the rise of xenophobic right-wing populism, and so on. But I think fundamentally, I think what's important to recognize in this situation is this is really the end of modern promise of progress, because the modern enlightenment idea is that of course we always have many problems, but with technologies, with economic growth, with new human rights, we can always kind of overcome, make progress. So there is a kind of story, grand narrative of better future. And that's really tied to this idea of emancipation. Even Marx, who was very critical of capitalism, had this kind of idea of modern progress. In the end, we will have kind of emancipation and so on. But I think if we look at today's situation, the future will not be emancipation. Future will not be progress. Future is rather regression. Future will be more chaos. Future will be more poverty, maybe. And what we can do is no longer hoping for emancipation. What we can do at best is adaptation. So this shift from emancipation to adaptation, this is a very, I think, the fundamental change, which the German sociologist Philipp Stab actually wrote a very good book on this topic, can be characterized as the fundamental condition of our world today, and which I call it the end of modernity. So this is a big change, right? So we don't really have good answer how to deal with this. But in this sense, it's understandable that many people don't see any answers and feel powerless.
Do you think, Kohit, that a lot of your thinking on this subject is determined by the Japanese experience of, very rapid growth in the post-war era, to the point where Japan was once, the rival to the United States, that the United States was supposed to fear and to battle the role that China plays today. And then we've seen, a very different scenario in the last 3 decades. To what extent this sort of adjustment or adaptation to a world of no progress, to a world of no emancipation, to what extent do you think Japan has managed to achieve that, or is it achieving it at all? Did it even try to achieve that, or is just is sort of it's a victim of inertia at this point?
So if we still stick to this old idea of progress and continuous growth and the kind of like continuous hope for emancipation, uh, the reality will be something very different. I think there will be more competition over resources, over land, water, and these two now gigantic power in the US and China, they now fight for the new hegemony. And this situation is quite similar to 100 years ago, the 1920s and 30s, and understandably there's a new rise of fascism. But I think what's very unique about today's situation is that in the 100 years ago, there was a strong communist movement, strong left-wing movement. And that is why the capitalists decided to unite with fascists, right? So that's really the emergence of fascism for the sake of protecting capitalism. But today, it's really different. There's no strong left-wing movements, but we are in a very deep crisis of capitalism. So the capitalism, in order to protect itself, they had to build a new alliance with some kind of fascist. It can be different in each country, but I think one of the interesting example is a new uh, techno-fascism. So this is a kind of a technocratic control over the people, and that's something what we witnessed with Trump and Elon Musk, and then that's didn't really work because of two egos. But I think there is something, this kind of techno-fascism is the real threat now, and it's really uh, something that changes this optimistic idea, especially dominant in the last 30 years after the Cold War. That is the end of history. End of history is not end of modernity. This is more like the permanent kind of stability. Globalization will spread democracy and economic growth everywhere and so on. But the reality became something totally different. And I think no one really has a good answer how to sort of manage this situation. And then many people are so desperate about finding some kind of stability, leading to this fusion of techno-fascism and very strong right-wing leaders. It's the same in Japan. I mean, I was surprised. I was in Germany for 1 year. Now I came back to Japan. And then all of a sudden, in the last 6 months or so, because of inflation, people are now starting to vote for right-wing party. So it's now finally coming to Japan, and I understand your feeling in Argentina or in the US and so on.
Veronica, I mean, do you think that this, disappearance or delegitimization of the left that Kohei is talking about, the left which had for decades and decades offered an ethic of solidarity and justice and compassion, the fact that that political, intellectual, moral formation really kind of went missing suddenly 3 decades ago. And what we were left with was essentially a political regime or economic regime or an ethical regime that emphasized acquisition, competition, greed. And I think, do you think that the feelings of disempowerment and the kind of general disenchantment with democracy has to do with the fact that the ways in which people mobilized in the past against injustice, those ways themselves were delegitimized and they also ceased to be effective. I mean, I think one major source of powerlessness today is the fact that majority after majority in Europe and America is opposed to Israeli actions in Gaza, and yet the governments fail to respond to those majorities. They are literally elected to carry out the wishes of the people, but the wishes of the people are being systematically ignored. But that's only one instance of where democratic institutions are no longer responsive, political classes are no longer responsive, and of course, the media is, in a variety of ways, complicit in this sort of, larger democratic dysfunction. I would love to know your thoughts, Veronica, on this, especially, from the sort of Argentinian perspective.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Pankaj, and thank you, Kohei, for your first intervention. For sure, we are in a new moment of recolonization through financial and military forces, and we are experiencing here in Argentina in a very concrete way. But at the same time, I would like to challenge this universal feeling of disempowerment or empowerless, not because I have a naive or optimistic view, rather to emphasize what kind of other actions and imaginaries that are now in action. For example, putting the resistance against the genocide in Gaza are taking place and are building from below, I think, a new kind of internationalism. I think this is a big challenge because we do not have, in fact, older communist parties or other left organizations, but I think that a new kind of internationalism from below is taking place with different kind of strategies. And I think that the strategy to reject, to enjoy the annihilation of part of humanity is an anti-fascist act. And I think it's very interesting how there is a connection and a coordination of, you can think in minor actions, but also in big action, like the general strike in Italy last Monday, for instance. So I think that we have to learn also a lot from peoples and communities, at least in Latin America, is very clear, who are resisting against the modern paradigm of progress and develop since a lot of years. So the social movements, the most important social movements in our region, are part of a big tradition of critique against modernization, for example. And we have a long history of critique of the yes, this way of thinking progress as new ways of colonizations. So I think of that we have to learn from these experiences and take very seriously the new strategies of coordination from below. And of course, in Argentina, we are living this fascist government. Argentina is a kind of laboratory of those politics of dispossession and cruelty. And at the same time, it's interesting how we are living also a big resistance against the politics of the government. And also, we are experiencing here with a sort of new atmosphere of anti imperialist politics against how Milei is trying to get support from Trump directly with this financial rescue. And I think that the power that the people are feeling in the streets, doing things together, but also coordinating in the level of social reproduction for other ways to resolve everyday economy. It is important also to think in terms of what are the sources of energy, what are the sources of this capacity to act that we can experience and we can nurture and we can coordinate in different levels. So I think that, of course, the other thing is what you were mentioning about the crisis of democracy and in particular the democratic institutions. And I think that this crisis of democracies in our country is something that we have already experimented in the so-called democratic transition, because we have the experience of a very limited democracy, very much connected with the legacy of the dictatorship, but also with the confinement of the national debt that is all the time organizing these limits, these boundaries of democracy. So now I think that what we are confronting is what are the new political landscape that we can imagine beyond these uh, um, forms of democracy that we have already experimented as unequal, sexist, classist, and racist.
What I mean, I think I'm interested in sort of understanding what is the sort of ethic driving these kinds of new mobilizations. Obviously, progress, modernity are suspect like never before, and as you said, the kind of equation of progress with colonization, with dispossession, has made progress highly suspect to, not just people in Argentina or Latin America, but in various other parts of the world. So if you're not working towards a better material future, then what kind of future are we
Mhm.
working towards? Because we are inevitably working towards one by, creating certain conditions in the present. We certainly are not religious enough anymore, any longer, to posit religious values in the future. So what is, I would love to know from you,
Yeah.
what is the particular sort of ethic? And of course, saving the planet, yes, that can be one way of thinking about the future and committing oneself morally to it. But what are the other ways you think that are relevant here?
I am thinking in a sort of shift in focus to speak less, for example, that's here is something very common to speak about how to break individualism from, for example, and I am more interested in how to instead dispute the desire for community, because I think that the ultra far right, it is all the time talking about individualism and competition and so on, but at the same time they are disputing the terrain of the collective. And for example, we can see it very concretely here with the financial tools and the financial world in general. Through gambling and different speculative dynamics, they are offering to the young people, for example, another ideas of communities, but also with religious fundamentalism. They are interpolating all the time this desire to be part of a group, and of course with a supremacist and sexist form. So I think that this dispute in the terrain of collective desire, in the terrain of the necessity to be part of something, to belong to a collective, to a group, it's at stake at the center of the political dispute. So when you were talking about ethics, I think that ethics in a sort of strategic sense, that we can, not in an abstract sense, it is, well, what increases our power to act. And I think that this feeling of belonging, of being part of something bigger, it's a stake. And I think that the experience that we have when we participate, for example, in a demonstration or a collective act or in a very small or very massive action, is a feeling in your body that enables you to, well, to feel this kind of power, but at the same time to de-universalize this feeling of empowerlessness. And at the same time, I think that this strategic way to produce other narratives and other narratives of what we are doing, what we are confronting, at least in Argentina, is very powerful against the media, of course, because they are all the time arguing in favor of austerity as a sort of moral consensus. And I think that all the protests in the streets are connecting austerity with fascism, and they are confronting this way of universal mandate. And I think it is, yes, it's a sort of ethic rejection to austerity. It is an ethic rejection to the economy of obedience that inflation is producing. And at the same time, I think that, well, of course, we are dealing with these very strong forces of financialization, militarization, criminalization, sexism, and racism in everyday life. But at the same time, I am seeing this kind of collective body that is producing a political community against this idea of austerity as the only way to regain some kind of well-being.
Mm. Uh, Go ahead. I mean, I suppose the far right, to a certain extent, now that you've just told us that the far right is surging in Japan, obviously its way of functioning in Japan is different. It's actually different in every country. But one thing there is in common between all the very many different far right projects is this desire, which obviously, the progressive forces or the anti-far right forces also want to harness, which is a desire to invoke a collectivity, to make people feel themselves part of a political community. So, in one sense, I would love to know Veronica's views on this too in a second. But in one sense, the right and the left are engaged in a struggle to define these sort of collective passions or the feelings of belonging to a collectivity. With the far right, of course, it's much easier for them because what they offer is the seductive poison of hatred, of hating something or other, whether it's a metropolitan elite or some group of people, a minority, or some foreign country. With the left, it's a much more complicated project because it's not a politics based upon uh, distrust and hostility towards the other. Um, if you were to imagine an emancipatory struggle that gets us out of this trap of powerlessness, go ahead. How would you see it? I mean, I know you're very pessimistic generally about the prospects of emancipation or progress. In the most sort of minimal sense, how would you imagine this kind of struggle?
No, no, I mean, I'm pessimistic about climate change, but I'm not really negating some kind of progressive politics. We still do need that kind of progressive politics in the age of climate breakdown. We may no longer have this socialism or barbarism thing. Even if we build socialism, it's gonna be in barbarism. So I call it socialism in barbarism. It's no longer either or. We cannot avoid climate breakdown anymore, but we can still try to build some kind of post-capitalist society beyond imperialism, beyond patriarchy, beyond class exploitation, and so on. And here, I think one of the things that I actually share with MAGA people, and I understand that they're feeling for supporting Trump too. I mean, actually, they actually problematize many things that I also problematize, right? I mean, this is kind of like a neoliberal globalization. The democratic liberal parties don't really talk about class issues anymore. They only talk about the issue of recognition and so on. They don't talk about redistribution anymore. This Nancy Fraser recognition redistribution thing, and then many workers felt kind of abandoned, and they suffer from paying rent. They don't, profit from financial sectors and so on. So I also criticize those things. So I actually do understand what they are so dissatisfied with this today's society, and I understand why they actually also vote for Trump or other more strong leaders. They want change. So there is a strong desire for social change. People know actually very well that today's capitalism is not working for them. It's just working for certain people. The solution is very problematic. It's anti-immigration, negation of climate change, and these things really don't, at least from my point of view, don't provide a real answer. But I think the desire is there. So I also understand why Donald Trump is actually also popular in Japan because Japanese people, experiencing the 30 years of economic stagnation, they want change. And Trump always comes up with some kind of crazy ideas, but at least he's challenging the conventional business as usual. So I think some Japanese people are quite excited with this kind of power to transform society. But what's problematic is again, it's associated. This desire is associated with a very authoritarian leader, top-down transformation. So I think here we need more of left-wing populism. I think populism as such is not necessarily a bad thing. Populism emerges when the existing politics doesn't represent well the people anymore. It's the same with the American Populist Party in the 19th century. So it's really the moment when the class issue today, other you know issues become so pressing, but the existing two-party system doesn't really represent their voices. Then populist moment comes in. I think the problem is I think the left-wing populism is not doing very well. But I think yeah, maybe Veronica, you are right. There might be a new strikes, new movements emerging again from below, and they might really go beyond this identity politics thing finally, and then they really build some kind of emancipatory progressive politics for the working class. And then one example is President Petro in Colombia. The other example will be hopefully Zola Mamdani in the mayor, New York City. So I mean, I'm not, I'm not saying that nothing is happening, but yeah, that situation is still very contingent. Yeah.
And do you think these sort of movements from below, they can address this sort of feelings of, which are very personal, and obviously exist very profoundly in the inner lives of many individuals today. The feeling of helplessness is left-wing populism, if such a thing were to be present, not just in Japan, but in other places, would they address this sort of feelings of alienation and helplessness that many people feel? Or is political process now too divorced or too separate from the private lives of individuals? Has a very important split occurred between private lives and public lives? So no matter what the state of politics might be, people continue to feel helpless and powerlessness, and I feel have feelings of powerlessness. We haven't, I mean, we've spoken about climate change, but AI, which is another
Mhm.
factor in making people feel powerless. And I wonder whether any kind of political movement, whether on the right or on the left, addresses that adequately, that sort of fear that many people have that they would be rendered redundant, that they would be the superfluous human beings of the future. So there is that other battle to be waged, which is not primarily political. I would love to know your thoughts on that. First, go
Yeah,
ahead, Veronica.
that makes things much harder today, right? The problem is those AI or those platform technologies can actually directly work up on our consciousness, thinking, and even desire. And we ask questions to AI, and then AI said give us some answers, and then many people do follow. They believe what AI says. So that really deprives humans of capacity to think logically and critically. And it's very easy to manipulate for the big tech companies our behaviors today. So in that sense, it's very hard to, you know, radicalize people's desire because if you ask AI, you never get the very radical ideas. They give us like some good ideas, not too radical, like not too right wing, not too left wing. It's a lot of moderate answers, but people really follow that kind of ideas. Then we become much more uh, conform. So that's a very one-dimensional society emerging. That's very bad news for at least Marxist socialists. Yeah.
Veronica?
Yes, I think that we are having the experience of this big machine of expropriation of collective intelligence, because at the same time that we know that AI is this, well, accumulation of collective information, of personal data, and a lot of, well, different resources that came from the people. They are being reorganized and, of course, monetized by this big tech. So this experience of expropriation and at the same time, this very intimate experience, as Kohei was saying, about that everyone can trust and ask even for advice for AI. I think that it's also the experience of how we can connect with collective intelligence in other ways. So for me, this is the question. And I was thinking also in how when Kohei was saying, you were saying, well, I share with Trump followers some kind of critiques of capitalism. I think it is interesting how they are capturing despair. I think rather than we are sharing, they are capturing our despair and preserving the private property relations through the logic of war. Is the traditional definition of fascism by Walter Benjamin. How the war is the big machine of capital to mobilize energies and to preserve at the same time private property relations. So I think that we have this problem of private property. I think it is a task for progressive social movements, left wing, how we can reframe and confront private property in very concrete ways. I think it is one of the elements in which we can work with this sense of powerlessness. The other thing is how we can think in scales and rhythm of transformations. I think it is a two-side problematic that we have to afford from social movements or collectives' actions. And the other one is about what you were saying, Pankaj, about the crisis of democratic institutions, but also political parties and populist projects. And I think that, of course, there are a crisis of representation that is still going on. And at the same time, a very pragmatic election for progressive forces in some moments that are sustained at the same time that the crisis of representation is still going on. So, of course, at least in Latin America, the definition of populism is very different that from Euro-American traditions. I think that here, maybe, I don't know what is the experience in India, but some reflections in terms of political theory from India, we feel very close in terms that we can think more in terms of popular politics that from below enacts a capacity of relation with the representative system rather than the populist phantasm or devil of the people going crazy. So I think there is a political rationality in populism. And it is a challenge in terms of connection between the movements from below and the representative system in a very strategical way. And I think this gap, it is still open. It is still, dramatic. But I think it is something at the core of politics. It's not something that will be close. It is something that is not possible to avoid, I think.
Let's actually move to some of the questions that have come in from the audience. We just had the United Nations General Assembly, still going on, in fact, and some of these speeches were world historical, in not a good way, unfortunately. in that they, especially Donald Trump's speech, kind of indicated a general decline in the credibility and authority of the United Nations, and indeed American willingness to, American unwillingness now at this point to continue to support international institutions of coordination and so on. There were also speeches by other, leaders, most remarkably by Lula, President Lula of Brazil, who went against, the sort of far right rhetoric and spoke about global cooperation and efforts, particularly on climate change. Um, and Pedro Sanchez of Spain spoke about the importance of immigrants, not just their importance to, the economy, but actually, a larger sense of the confrontation with the stranger and the richness that that kind of encounter brings to our societies. I think the question is, do you think, we are facing an irreversible decline of the United Nations general, international law, conventions, or, and this is the hopeful scenario, are we looking at a kind of blip which has been made possible by several far-right governments being in power at the same time in some of the biggest, most important countries of the world? I think it relates to our sort of, question of powerlessness, in the sense that the way we define this question is also perhaps helping us feel or think of ourselves as powerful or possessed of a certain kind of capacity to change things, or feel utterly powerless. Veronica, you go first.
Well, it's a very difficult question because we are in this dramatic question about, are we defending uh, the international system that we were critiquing last years, and the ultra right is trying to explode this formal international system. I think that, as you have written, Gaza changes everything in terms of international law, in terms of human rights discourses, in terms of, well, what we are seeing as this new way of colonization, real estate speculation, annihilation, and I think that the empowerment of the nations, the state nations, in front of the genocide is the real core of empowerment, is the real image of how they cannot confront powers. So I think that all the international law system and the international system of state nations and international institutions are at stake and are trembling, and they are trying to, I think, reorganize in a sort of imaginary of the ultra-right wing against this international terrain and level of action.
Interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, so again, Trump is right. He's criticizing that the UN is not working well, and that's something that the left wing have been criticizing for many years, as Veronica pointed out. And but the problem is, Trump is also the reason why the UN is not functioning now. So this is this very strange situation. But this problem is now. This situation is very ironical that the left wing or liberals always do, but even like left wing people are trying to defend the UN or other those like bourgeois institutions, right? So really like losing this capacity for thinking and acting in a radical manner. And but yeah, but what my point is, yes, this is a little bit problematic, but I understand that the liberals have no chance of winning, because Trump at least say that he's listening to the MAGA people. He at least says that, oh, you guys are right. You guys suffer from capitalism, globalization, and so on. I mean, he doesn't, of course, criticize capitalism, but in some sense, he does, right? And liberals always say, "Oh, you guys are deceived by fake news," and it's basically very elitist, top down, and the masses are kind of stupid. They're always tempted to those leaders like Trump because they are stupid. How do people change their minds when liberals behave like that? I mean, no one. I mean, they just become more and more angry about liberals. So I think now we are in a very difficult situation. We really have to come up with a very different kind of ideas. So I actually clearly distinguish liberals and left wing progressive. So, but yeah, it's very hard. I mean, now we don't, of course, have any other international organizations that can replace UN. So, for left wings, it's very hard to provide something concrete and positive. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, that's the situation.
What do you think, Pankaj, about this point?
I think, I mean, I agree that this is, an attempt, obviously, to salvage at least some of the international system that was set up in place after 1945, not with a great deal of optimism or hope, but with the sense that we need some of that architecture to remain with us and not to fall victim to these destructive forces of nihilism, which, as you say, are at one level encouraging a certain kind of aggressive hyper individualism, and also, organizing people in these sort of communities of hatred against both, minorities at home, minorities elsewhere, encouraging enmity and hostility to other nation states. And I think, those international institutions were set up, including the United Nations, in the 1940s, precisely to preempt this world that is coming into being. So it's quite natural for even the radicals, who don't believe in these international systems or believe that they are there to do the bidding of the United States, for them to say, look, can we at least have these even very formal nominal structures? Because what we are looking at right now is a near total destruction of those institutes. So it's an understandable impulse. Like, we need still a platform where people can come together and talk to each other, even if they are berating each other, as we saw in the last week. At least there is some kind of a platform there. Um, so I mean, I share, obviously, a great deal of skepticism about many of these international institutions, but I also know we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater,
Mhm,
um,
mhm,
and that, we should have a pragmatic view at this point at least, because this is a very dangerous moment. This is a really cannot overestimate the dangers of this, political conjuncture. Just there's so many things that can go wrong. So we need to continue this conversation and dialogue, even if it's defined largely by hostility and antagonism at this point. Let's look at some of the other questions that have come in. There is, I mean, I think, I mean, I suppose one of the reasons why there is this sense of powerlessness is because a lot of the institutions that were entrusted with a kind of representation, not so much political representation, but they were conceived as sort of, places where a certain kind of ethical thinking and remedies could be offered. And I'm thinking really largely of centers of education, whether it's universities or schools or kind of institutions of higher learning, I think because they're also feeling this enormous pressure now, um, from both governments and often sort of far right movements who bring a certain kind of old resentment of these institutions into play. So I think, there's a question about, why are these institutions not sort of standing up to this kind of bullying by the state and, these sort of very aggressive far right movements. I'd love you to answer that question. I mean, what are the reasons where we see actually not only institutions of higher learning education, but also the other pillar of democracy, which is the fourth estate, not actually even grasping this moment, understanding it, diagnosing it correctly.
I think that in Argentina, at least, the public universities and the teachers and the schools, public schools, and also the national scientific systems and the researchers are, well, very much mobilized. We had last year like two different demonstrations, 1 million people each. And last week, we have a big demonstration in favor of public health and public education. And I think that it is part of this collective body of resistance that I was talking before. And in the government of Argentina, the public universities, and especially the most popular public universities, where you can find the first generations of university students, are being targeted because, well, of course, the government see these places as places of common resources, of the political critique, and of course, this desire of dispute or this feeling of community, I think. So at least in Argentina, I think that is a very important element of resistance, critique, but also passional defense of the commons that are yes, unraveled through the public institutions that are very important. And at the same time, of course, the government here has all this delirium about building a new intellectual landscape through, well, private institutions, private think tanks. And I think that these private think tanks are disputing also this international platform that you were saying before. I think it is a very important component to talk about what other images of international platforms we are confronting, because they have a lot of money, they have a lot of capacity to pressure, and they are disputing imaginaries, vocabularies, and this intellectual sensibility.
Interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, for example, in Japan, we used to have many socialists, Marxist professors, but in the last 30 years, those people retired and then their positions were not reproduced. So now the universities in Japan are generally very apolitical. And 5 or 6 years ago, there was a problem with the Science Council of Japan. So there's like 100, 200 members of the from the scientists, and they make some advice for the government and so on. And then 6 new people are nominated, and then they must be confirmed by the government. But the government rejected or declined to confirm their nomination. So that became very big issue because that's really like the government intervening in the nomination of science council based on what kind of political views those nominated scientists have. And it's still going on issue, but even after that kind of the government intervention, we didn't have anything equivalent of what Veronica just said. There was no demonstrations. There were some actions, there were some petitions, but nothing really big happened. And also the problem is the general society, outside academia, people are not interested in this issue. And then the fundamental problem, and I think that's also common in the US, the people are not simply regarding universities as the place of liberal ideas, I mean, which might be the case in the US, but I think many people are, you know, sort of dissatisfied with how the government uses the money for the universities because the university professors are well paid, but that what they do don't have nothing to do with many people outside academia. So we still do write some papers, we still do write books, but do many people actually read? Um, Most of the books just piece of shit. No one read it. So I
Oh,
think
sure.
that kind of situation really need to change. But I think that today's journal review and everything, the scientific journals, impact factors and everything, really created this kind of divide and also this kind of very basic mission of science in service of humanity. And in that sense, we do need some kind of socialist science that's really for the people, the knowledge as commons. But yes, that's something I think it's also the good opportunity to transform how the university produces knowledge for society,
Yeah. Well,
not
I
for.
should offer simply as a contrast, the experience of South Asia, recent experience of South Asia, where we've seen massive political movements that have actually resulted in literally in regime change in Sri Lanka,
Mhm.
Bangladesh, very recently in Nepal, led by young people, many of them students. Universities were a major site for the mobilization of many of these, protesters or demonstrators who created this change, really kind of against some incredibly corrupt and incompetent governments, which brings us, actually, I think the only question we have time for, which is like, what is your advice to young people who are feeling powerless today? What could be the sources of hope for them in building a future, quite apart from these examples we have of young people actually going out there and mobilizing and protesting against their conditions. Veronica, you go first. Very quick.
Yes, I think that the experience of building some kind of community that could seem very minimal at the beginning, but it is a way to, well, de-universalize, I insist with that, this feeling of powerlessness. I think it's very important. So challenging this idea of the individual power that is not really an idea even in the ultra right wing. So I think that my encouragement is, yes, this kind of experimental uh, challenge of building community. And I think that the making of the community, it is something that is very interesting to yes, to experiment, and also to have the experience of these rhythm scales and strategies that I was thinking before as a sort of agenda that we have to develop.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm older, so I have some advice for the younger generations. And I said that in the last 15, 20 years, a lot of movements. But actually, when I entered university, so 2005, there was like really no movements. And when Obama, I was in the U.S. University, and when Obama was elected, it was like a revolution happened. Like everyone like celebrating. After that, many things happened. We had a much more progressive movement in the last 10 years or so. So now it's fading out, fading away, and then we feel very pessimistic. But 30 years ago or 25 years ago, no one really believed that climate change became such a huge issue in politics, in society. It was only a problem for scientists, but it really changed. I think it's the same with transgender rights, it's the same with other issues too. So actually, in some sense, if you look at like 30 years or so, we are making big progress as well. And also now we are, of course, it's true that we might lose some of the basic human rights or limitation of the freedom of speech and so on. But we have this risk of losing these very fundamental rights because older generation achieved these rights, won these rights, right? So it didn't exist before, couple of hundred years ago. It didn't exist. But now we do have this. We took for granted, but it can be gone anytime. So that's like our responsibility to protect those basic rights and of course deepen those rights because older generation expanded the rights. So why don't we also expand them? So the situation, of course, gets worse sometime, and it can get better. Of course, the climate change is getting worse and worse. So that's the kind of new dimension that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar today. But in other dimensions, we still have the ample opportunities to expand many spheres of freedom. And so that's something that what we should continue fighting for.
That's a great note to end on, Kohei, on a note of hope and also vigilance, so that our hard-won rights are not frittered away. Thank you both, Veronica, and thank you all for attending. And I hope you'll join us in the next webinar, which is on the 8th of October. And I'll be joined then by Nasreen Malik and Hisham Matar on the subject of calling out cruelty. Thanks again, and see you in October.